It's no secret that From Software creates some of the greatest games of our time. This is shown by one of their first games spawning an entire genre that would become globally renowned for its difficulty and its cruelty, but also for having complex combat, seamless worlds, beautifully tragic stories, and jaw-droppingly stunning cinematics that rival actual movies. Every single From Software game is widely considered as flawless masterpieces in their own right. But is this really the truth? Of course it isn't. Every single Soulsborne, Ring, Hero game has its own problems, and I'm not just talking about that horrific amalgamation of a title these games were given. From the clunky feel of Dark Souls 1, the linearity and generally easier gameplay of Dark Souls 3, or literally the entirety of Dark Souls 2. These games are far from perfect, but at the same time, all of these small imperfections to an extent are forgettable due to the overwhelming beauty of the elements within these titles. However, there is one thing that often gets forgotten about when we speak of the imperfections in From Software games. A symphony of the most flawed, lazy design choices and of course rage-induced pain and suffering. Welcome to the largest failure of game design in the history of From Software. When we speak of From Software games that are considered to be true masterpieces, Bloodborne will spring to mind for many people, and it's this exact game that we will be speaking about. Bloodborne is a game that I've spoken about in a lot of depth on this channel for how incredible every element of it truly is and how these elements were all perfectly executed with absolutely no issues at all. Okay, maybe not every element. Bloodborne was a complete shift up to the Souls formula with its simplified weapon upgrade system, blood gem system, rally system, the removal of weight and poise, and most importantly, the introduction of Chalice Dungeons. Chalice Dungeons have been a massive piece of criticism for the game by every single person who has played through them since day one. But why is this? Well, the main point of criticism is the repetitive nature of the bosses and the level design of the layers, and then on top of this you have the glaring issues of the procedurally generated root chalices. But before we get into the rabbit hole of incompetence and criticism, allow me to explain what the Chalice Dungeons even are for those of you who haven't had a chance to play this masterpiece in gaming. The Chalice Dungeons were an extra piece of optional content that was slapped into Bloodborne as a way to get more powerful gems for New Game Plus, as well as bringing a new challenge for new and returning players alike. As much as their inclusion in the game seems rather bizarre, they actually have an incredible amount of significance in the lore, as these are the remnants of the city of Tumeru that the Yharnam we all know and love was constructed on top of. The dungeons were also where Abritus, daughter of the cosmos, was discovered, and by extension the Old Blood. Not only that, but one of the central characters of the game, Queen Yharnam, was also discovered down here. And as I am sure a lot of you know, all three of these acted as the catalyst for most of the story that we experience in the game. The Chalice Dungeons are an incredibly interesting concept for late game content, and the procedurally generated root chalices would, in theory, create an endless amount of content for consecutive playthroughs. So there is never a sense of boredom for players who like to do extreme amounts of New Game Plus runs, or just new time players that want to experience everything the game has to offer. And in that regard, this content should be a massive success. However, we can't judge the success or failure of a feature or content on theory alone. We must also look at the most important factor that conclusively determines which bracket it falls under, and that is of course the execution. And as I am sure you could all tell by the title of this video, it isn't a pretty result. So without wasting any more time, let's dive right into the failures of the Chalice Dungeons. Before we can actually enter the Chalice Dungeon, we need to first talk about how to obtain an actual chalice, and there are 4 different chalices that all have different dungeons attached to them. These chalices are the Tumeru Chalice, which you get after beating the Bloodstar Beast in Old Yharnam, the Hintertome Chalice, which is very easy to miss as it's hidden away in one of the central Tumeru Chalice dungeons, the Iz Chalice, which you get after beating Abritus, and finally the Ailing Loran Chalice, which you can obtain from beating the Amygdala in the Nightmare Frontier. Once you have one of those, you can return to the headstones in the Hunter's Dream, and assuming you have the echoes necessary, you can just enter the, oh yeah, you need items to enter the chalice. So this is actually the first issue I take with the chalices. They all require special items that you must either find in the world or inside the dungeons themselves. Now, most of the time, this isn't really a big problem, but where it gets really frustrating is with the red jelly item and the living thread. The way you obtain these items is actually pretty obscure, and this is especially the case with the living thread, as you will not be able able to find it without googling it, as you must kill the brain of Mensis, and that is already very easy to miss. But to be fair, you can purchase an infinite amount of them after doing this, but it still can be very frustrating if you don't know where to look. Now let's get on to the actual chalices themselves. The early Tumeru dungeons are pretty straightforward. You look for the lever, kill the boss, enter the next layer. When you first do the chalices, it can be really fun as you get to see new bosses and enemies you wouldn't have really seen in the main game. But after the second or third chalice, this starts getting old really fast. Speaking of which, accessing the later dungeons can be very annoying and time consuming, as you'll need to either explore literally every corner of the dungeons to find the items necessary to progress, or just farm for them, which is incredibly inconsistent and very, very boring. Now, I want to start talking about the main attraction of any Souls game, and that is the bosses. In the Chalice Dungeons, there are three main types of bosses that you will encounter, and we'll go through them one by one. The first group of bosses consist of the most random enemies that are from the main story areas, for example the Brainsuckers, the beast from the Forbidden Woods, and that pig that you fist for blood echoes in Margot's Loft. This group of bosses is actually incredibly interesting, but not for being actually decent or interesting fights, but instead for how baffling it is that From Software actually thought this was an acceptable level of quality. There are little to no differences in these fights to when you encounter them in the main story areas. It's incredibly sloppy and just outright lazy. But hey, I'm sure this isn't going to become a recurring problem. The next set of bosses are the ones that were actually specifically made for the chalices. For instance, the Watchdog of the Old Lords, the Temerian Descendants, the Merciless Watcher, the Keeper of the Old Lords, the Abhorrent Beast, the Bloodletting Beast, the Watchdog of the Old Lords, the Temerian Descendants, the Merciless Watchers, the Abhorrent Beast, the Bloodletting Beast. I'm sure you get the point. Nearly every single unique boss in the chalices either gets reused as a normal enemy or just a different boss in a different chalice. And the final set of bosses in this lazily built content is the repeated bosses from the main story. These three sets of bosses will be repeated over and over again as you descend through the list of the chalice dungeons. And just as you get used to the monotony of the early Tumeru chalices, you'll eventually beat the final boss of the lower Tumeru chalice and you will obtain a brand new chalice. It's not like anything you've ever seen before. No, this is new, the Cursed and Defiled Chalice. Upon entering this chalice, you are most likely unknowingly walking straight into the heart of why the chalice dungeons are From Software's biggest failure, and what will shortly become the worst decision you have ever made. The largest defense of the Souls community for the game's obscene difficulty is that the games are hard, but they're fair. And now this was clearly a memo that didn't come across the desk of the team who designed the Cursed and Defiled Chalice, because this crock of shit is outright bullshit. The whole gimmick that was used to increase difficulty for this chalice was just to take away half of your health, and now this wouldn't be a problem if every enemy in this dungeon wouldn't one-shot you before you can even get an R1 out. I can't even begin to describe the level of rage and outright apathy that I felt while going through this dungeon. It was actual hell. The Watchdog reappearing as the first boss of the chalice was an absolute pain in the ass, because something I didn't get to mention about the Watchdog previously was that it has some broken hitboxes on its attacks, so it can actually just one-shot you for no damn reason other than it just feels like it. Although there is one good thing I do have to say about the Cursed and Defiled Chalice, and it's just how good the Blood Echo Returns is for actually being able to kill anything in here. It isn't actually too uncommon to reach 100,000 echoes down here, but to be completely honest, it's rare to keep them. But of course, when the Chalice Dungeons giveth, it also slappeth the shit out of you for even trying to play through these levels. And now the ultimate slap across your silly little face comes in the form of the Amygdala. Yeah, you remember that absolute pushover of the boss from the first Nightmare level? Well, she's back for some fun in this chalice, and well, let's just dive straight into it because I have a lot to say. This fight is such a roadblock that it requires its own section, because this is the culmination of everything that is wrong with the Chalice Dungeons. Now, this fight isn't actually too hard in theory, but what makes it so difficult is that the arena is relatively small, the player has half health, and the Amygdala has 10,000 HP! And this actually would make her rank 5th in terms of health out of every single boss in the entire franchise. Now, something that I want you to take note of is she actually has less health than the Defiled Watchdog, but what makes her a harder boss is that she is resistant to nearly every single form of damage in the game. Oh, and by the way, if you even dare move an inch, she can easily one-shot you with her jumping attack. Now, the only real method to beat this fight without pulling your hair out is actually to just get behind her to bait the jump attack, extend your weapon with L1. When she lands, her head will be right in front of you, so you can use a charged R2, then you get a visceral and rinse and repeat. Now, this strategy isn't exactly foolproof either, because she could just give you bad RNG and kill you with her full arm swing. The first time I actually managed to beat her, I literally sat underneath her for about 30 minutes just swinging on her limbs. What makes this worse is that popping a beast blood pellet for the extra damage, which by the way, if you want to breeze through this game, then there's your strategy, it's actually pretty pointless because more often than not, she'll one-shot you before you even get out the doorway. This fight is an unbelievably lazy rehash of a main game boss. She has way too much artificial difficulty and the arena is really small. There really isn't enough space to make this an actually fun fight. Like, yeah, okay, the room is pretty big, but it doesn't feel like that when you have an 8'3" nightmare-inducing boss jumping at you every 2 seconds. It just feels really claustrophobic and incredibly restrictive, and it turns what could be a very interesting and fun fight into more of a pain in the ass that just makes me want to put my head through a wall. But now, all in all, are the Chalice Dungeons really that bad that we can call it FromSoftware's biggest failure? After replaying the Chalice Dungeons quite a few times to write this script, I think I can honestly say that yes, they are. The dungeons are just some of the laziest content that they could have tacked on to what is really one of their best games, if not their best. And I really did try to enjoy the Chalices. They're really unique and a fun idea, but it just feels that From Software didn't really have the time to make something that is worth playing as a standalone. In my books, they did kind of make up for the disappointment that was the Chalice Dungeons with the DLC for Bloodborne, but I still find it unacceptable that the dungeons were released in the state that they were. Although I do feel like I need to say that there is actually a pretty good portion of the player base that really enjoy playing through the randomly generated chalices. And you know what? If that's you, then fair play to you. I never want these videos to dissuade you from enjoying what you enjoy. I instead want them to be the start of a conversation. So if you did enjoy them, then let me know why in the comments. But as a more formal conclusion, in my opinion, the Chalice Dungeons are absolutely incredible for the lore. Actually getting to fight Queen Yharnam was a really fun time, but it's just everything that leads up to that was just painful. After the first Chalice, I really didn't get much enjoyment out of them. It just feels really cheap and the boss choices didn't feel very well thought out. This feature has a whole lot of potential that I just don't think that From Software could realize in 2015, which is actually pretty sad because this content could have made Bloodborne an even better game than it already is. And hopefully now that we have a fully working version of Bloodborne on PC, thanks to emulation, we might see someone rework the dungeons and publish a mod for it. But as it stands right now, the Chalice Dungeons were a perfect example of having a great idea, just not at a great time. And that is the story of From Software's biggest failure. Thank you for watching.